All right, guys. So we're gonna go ahead and just get into the Battle of Kings Mountain. I think that's where we left off, if I'm not mistaken. But if we missed anything, we can certainly go over it when we get back into class on Friday with a little bit of time that we have. So Kings Mountain, if you guys remember, we talked about this. This is has one or a battle that has one of the largest colonial casualties of the war. And I think that we already fleshed this idea out, but the main reason was because this was fought between the Continental Army and the Continental Militia against the British militia, which was made up of those 40,000 colonials, right? So when we have this fighting going on, it's really colonists versus colonists, not too dissimilar from what we see with the Civil War, where the Civil War still to date has the largest casualties, American casualties of any war that or conflict that we've been involved in, because both sides are technically U.S. citizens. So every death is numbered among those. As a result, it's larger than it would otherwise be. So in King's Battle, we have the same thing happening here. Now, in a nutshell here, guys, and I said this already too, because it's kind of colonist versus colonist, you do have a more ferocious and vicious battle, because you have both sides of this trying to prove something. We have the colonial militia and Continental Army who are trying to show their patriotism to an independent America, combating the the British militia, who are trying to show their patriotism to the British Empire and the king. And so in both cases, they're trying to almost prove how loyal they are to their independent causes, and show that the other side should be supporting theirs. And as a result, it's a very, very heated battle. And we almost kind of related it to, in a more playful way, the idea of BYU versus Utah, where those games are really, really heated. And I'm not from Utah, so I don't really get into this conflict. I don't even understand why people care about it. They're not even in the same league. But you get the idea, because every time they play each other, it's all anybody talks about, for weeks before and weeks after. It's just that same kind of idea. Both sides are very, very heated in this battle. Now, in this battle, we have several things that are happening. Shortly before this battle, we have a man by the name of Tarleton. What was his first name? Bastron. Oh, what is it? I can't even remember. It's this gentleman right here that you guys see in this picture, this dragoon here in the green. And if any of you guys have actually seen the movie The Patriot, which is older and it's rated R, so if you have not seen it, do not go home and tell your parents that I'm telling you to watch it. But it is on Netflix, and if your parents are okay with it, I guess, watch it with their supervision. The main villain guy in that show is kind of loosely based off of this gentleman here, Tarleton. What is his first name? Bannister. Weird first name, but Bannister Tarleton. So, and in a battle just prior to Kings Mountain, the colonial troops had been outmaneuvered and kind of outclassed. And so in that battle, they surrender. And despite trying to surrender, waving the white flag kind of a thing, Tarleton continues his attack and kills many of the militia and the Continental Army after their surrender. And so to make matters worse, this had just happened. People are heated, and more importantly, the colonial militia and the Continental Army kind of want revenge for what they believed was unconventional and unethical military practices by Tarleton, which I think in a lot of ways most of us can agree with. But you've heard me say it a million times before. There are no rules in love and war, right? If you don't like the way that somebody is going to fight you because you think it's unethical or just whatever, then don't go to war, right? It's so much easier that way just to avoid that altogether. But regardless, though, they're going into this fairly heated. Now, along the way here, and you guys can see it in the image here, hopefully, you can see starting up here by the Sycamore Shoals, and I don't know actually if you guys can see my cursor, but we have a troop being led by Ferguson. I don't remember his first name, but a troop being led by Ferguson, or a group of British soldiers being led by Ferguson, and they're going to come down this direction. The whole time coming down, they are going to try to gather support for their cause by getting more colonials to join the militia, while also threatening the colonial militia and the Continental Army by saying by telling them to lay down their arms or suffer the consequences. So these two things happening back to back, where the colonists felt like they had been unjustly treated by the dragoons led by Tarleton, combined with what appears by Ferguson to be almost kind of like trash talking them or goading them into some sort of a fight, gets the colonial militia really riled up and heated up. And so, as you can kind of see here with Ferguson's troops, they are going to run into each other here right by Quakers Meadows, and pretty quickly Ferguson is going to realize that he doesn't have the upper hand as far as this battle is concerned, as far as numbers are concerned, and so he is going to try to retreat to get to Cornwallis, who is just there in North Carolina, in the northern part of South Carolina, okay, present-day South Carolina. So he is going to try and just retreat to that point. All the while, we can see here with the red is the colonial militia giving chase. And because of their familiarity with the territory, they're able to actually kind of, they go along the broad river here and are able to get in front of the approach of, or the retreat of the British militia, and cut them off here in Kings Mountain, right there on the border between South Carolina and North Carolina. Okay, and a battle is going to ensue, and the whole time the colonial militia and Continental Army are yelling the chant, "Remember Tarleton's Quarter," where the colonial militias tried to surrender, and Tarleton continued his attack anyways, resulting in the death of many colonials who had actually surrendered. So they're going into this basically, when they say that, remember Tarleton's Quarter, this is them saying, we are going to give no quarter. We are not going to allow you to surrender. We are going to fight you guys to the death. And as a result of that, right, this does, again, as already mentioned, turns into an incredibly brutal and bloody battle, because neither side is necessarily going to provide quarter for the others or allow the others to surrender. And so a pretty big deal here. Now, with this, as always, we kind of like to talk about the responses, and we see the same kind of a response happening on both sides of this, because on the British side, here we have them fighting essentially kind of an enraged colonial army, and so if you are part of the British militia, this probably only serves as evidence that the colonials have gotten out of hand and that King George was correct in trying to squash their rebellion. Whereas if you were on the colonial side and you hear this story, remember Tarleton's Quarter, and how he didn't allow the soldiers to surrender and killed them after they surrendered in that specific battle, you're going to use that as justification for the war, and it will actually serve to bolster the numbers of the colonial army, the Continental Army and the colonial militia. Okay, so pretty heated battle here, highest death count for the colonists, guys, and hopefully we have some sort of an understanding as to why, and a super important battle for any colonist, because so many colonists died during this battle that it was almost like everyone in the colonies felt the grief of this battle, felt the grief of loss from regardless of which side it was on. It was almost like like the Civil War, where you had brothers fighting brothers, right? Kind of a thing. And so pretty impactful battle in colonial America in the 1780s. Okay, now moving forward, we have the Battle of Cowpens, which you can actually kind of see right here. That we're going to have another battle here just to the west of Kings Mountain. Now, Cowpens is going to be Tarleton's force, right? And so with the Battle of Cowpens, we see Tarleton engaging, and this is a good, no, I shouldn't say a good opportunity, but this, at least in the view of the colonists, is a good opportunity to try and get even with Tarleton for what they argued were unethical military practices. And whether it's real or not, it's real in its consequences. And so they are going to, the colonial armies and militia are going to fight Tarleton's troops of about 1,000 British forces or soldiers, okay, under Tarleton, and they were set up against about 2,000 soldiers being led by Morgan. Now, Morgan's forces suffered only 25 casualties and 124 wounded. So, going back to this idea of Bunker Hill, if the colonists can continue to inflict more casualties on the British than they sustain, the goal is hopefully they can win this war. Now, I will also go into this idea we've talked about. They're accusing Tarleton of using unethical practices, but the idea of hiding behind trees and rocks and things like that, like guerrilla warfare as we call it today, which was often implemented, especially by the militia, was considered incredibly dishonorable and unethical by European standards, right? So we do see that kind of go in both directions here. Now, on the flip side, Tarleton's forces were almost completely eliminated, with almost 30% casualties and 55% of his forces being captured. So that means of that 1,000 troops under Tarleton's command, we see over 300 of them are going to die, and almost 600 of them are going to be captured or go missing, meaning that only about 100 or so, 150 or so, are actually going to escape this battle. I guess they have here about 200 are escaping. But Tarleton is also going to be one of those that escapes. Partially, I would argue, because he's a dragoon, right? He's on horseback. If you're not familiar with that term, dragoon is what we call somebody in the, or what was called somebody in the cavalry. Cavalry being somebody who rides a horse, just like we call somebody in the Navy, we call them a sailor, right? And so on, right? We have these different names for them. So, as a result, though, Tarleton is going to, his troops are going to be pretty much decimated there, and not much is going to be left. And I would say that in many ways this kind of puts an end to that idea of trying to gain revenge on Tarleton for what they believed were unethical tactics. But more importantly, the loss of such a powerful cavalry force is going to have a huge impact on the war. Okay, so Tarleton there will still have a fairly successful career, guys, and as I understand, he does eventually retire to, back to England, and he might even actually be involved a little bit in the wars against Napoleon, because he is fairly young here in the battle in the American Revolution. So I think he goes on to continue to have a very successful career despite the colonial complaints against his tactics. And again, I mentioned in the movie The Patriot, they kind of take this idea and run with it and make it worse. The guy's not called Tarleton in there, but we had that same idea where he's using these questionable tactics, not offering those who surrender any quarter, et cetera, et cetera. They try and play off of that in that movie, and obviously it's Hollywood, so they're taking a lot of liberties with that. Okay, all right. I think that's about all I want to say. We may go over a little bit more of this in class on Friday, but otherwise I think that's about all I want to say about that. And so finally, we're going to get into the Battle of Yorktown. And while the Battle of Yorktown is not the final battle here, guys, it is the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. And more importantly, it results in the surrender of Cornwallis, okay, one of the most prestigious British soldier or generals at this time, and certainly one of the most effective British generals in the Revolutionary War. I mean, he more or less just kind of goes from battle to battle, just winning, or just like victory after victory, because he's an incredible military leader. He's a very good military tactician, which we've talked about in the past when we talked about George Washington, where he was not necessarily a great tactician, but he was a very good leader, right? Cornwallis kind of has both those things. He is a good leader, although I would make the argument maybe not as good of a leader as George Washington. He, however, is a much greater military tactician. He's been very classically trained in every sense of the word. He's been involved in military combat for quite a while, and if my memory serves me correctly, on multiple continents, right? So in Europe, in the Americas, and I think also it was either India or in Africa as well. He's done some work there. So very skilled, very talented military leader here. And so Cornwallis is going to be represented by the red here. And Cornwallis, remember, Cornwallis was working his way north in an attempt to come and try and help Ferguson and also Tarleton there. Because if you guys remember, just across the border in this region here is where we're going to have the Battle of Cowpens and the Battle of Kings Mountain. Now, as they come further north here, they're going to have a few minor skirmishes, and he's going to try and take Charlottesville, but is eventually going to be more or less unsuccessful, and he's going to have to retreat here to Yorktown. Now, once he gets into Yorktown, the armies of the French and the American troops are essentially going to have been working their way south now and gaining momentum and gaining speed. And it gets to the point here where Cornwallis has essentially got his back to the wall, so to speak. Not necessarily to the wall, but he can't go forward. He's surrounded on all sides by the colonial militia, the French army, and the Continental armies. And so he realizes that his only chance here is to try and escape via boat into the harbor. And if he can get out right here, right, we see some of the other military leader or naval leaders here coming to give assistance. And if they can escape, then he can just relocate himself somewhere else and kind of essentially continue his rampage through the Americas. I shouldn't say rampage, is probably not the right word, but his string of victories, right? Again, being a very talented general. However, the French troops are going to come and stop the British troops here in the Capes with de Grasse and de Barras. I don't even know how you say that. Sorry, my French is terrible. And they're actually going to have a victory here over Graves' naval fleet. And as a result, they are going to remove the possibility of a retreat to sea. And we've talked about this multiple times. When they would get into these conflicts, the British, all else fails, could always hop on their ships and sail away because the colonials didn't have a navy, right, until they get the French navy as support. And then if the colonials lost, they could always run west into Indian territory and avoid pursuit. So there's kind of this, like, there's a way to escape almost always for most troops involved in these conflicts. However, in Yorktown, because the because the town is surrounded by the Continental forces as well as the French armies on one side, they are only left with the option of a naval retreat. Now, when the support of the French Navy arrives there and is able to be victorious in the Capes here, just outside of Yorktown in Virginia, they are going to leave Cornwallis with no choice but to surrender. Okay, so he will surrender here again. This is the last major battle, especially because it's a surrender from one of the major general of the British forces there in the Americas. Now, this gets us into what is probably my all-time favorite story in regards to the Revolution. Maybe not my all-time favorite story, but one of my favorite stories. So after this is over, typically what happens is there is this almost like a ceremony, right, when you surrender. And so if you've surrendered, you come out and you would present your weapon, your sword. And we talked about that, right? Those British sabers. Remember, we talked about that, how George Washington typically used the American cutlass, which was considered a less prestigious and a less elegant weapon, right? But they would present their sabers to the general that they lost to, almost kind of like a trophy, right? Like here's your token that you beat this general. You have their saber, right? And so they proceed to have this ceremony, and essentially what's going to happen is the troops will start marching by. They will disarm the troops, and the troops will just basically like stack their weapons all in a pile, and then they are typically allowed to leave, right? In these situations, not always. You might keep them prisoner or whatever else, but keep in mind, if you want to try and keep them prisoner, you have to have the resources to do that. Some sort of a prison. You'll have to have constant guard on them or whatever else, right? So most often in the cases of both the British and the colonials, when someone would surrender, they would just take their weapons from them, because then they could use those weapons. They disarm their enemies, so they can't really fight, or they can't fight until they get rearmed, and then they don't have to sit there and worry about like keeping guard, on all these prisoners, right? And feeding all these prisoners, and the cost that goes into any of those kinds of things, right? So they are letting them go, and the soldiers are being dismissed. They're lining up, and they are marching out. And as they're marching out, they are dropping their weapons basically in a big pile, turning them over to the colonists. Now, as mentioned, it was the standard at this time for the general to meet before the defeated general to meet before the victorious general and surrender their saber to them as kind of like a token of respect, saying like you've beat me, kind of a thing, and that was what was expected. Now, in this particular case, Cornwallis, who has this really successful career, he's been very well trained. He decides not to go out himself to present his arms to George Washington, because he, again, kind of feels that George Washington is beneath him. And we've talked about this. George Washington doesn't have a good reputation in Great Britain. They didn't think he was a good military leader or anything like that, right? And so he doesn't want to turn over his weapon to George Washington. So he sends out his second in command to go turn over his weapon, but not to Washington, who is the commander-in-chief of the entire British forces and leading the entire army. Even though there are still British or French generals there as well, they all answer to George Washington because he is the leader of the Continental Army, right? And so when the second in command for Cornwallis, I forget his name now, but it doesn't really matter, he comes out to deliver the saber as a token of surrender, right? he actually goes out and instead of handing it to George Washington, he presents it to the French, the leader of the French armies at this time, who was Lafayette. So they hand it to Lafayette rather than giving it to the commander of the entire force. And which, guys, think about this for just a second. That's kind of a slap in the face. It's not really a polite thing to do. It's basically saying George Washington didn't defeat me, the French defeated me, which in many ways is kind of true, but it was that joint effort of the two. And more importantly, it was still George Washington who was who was commanding the whole thing, telling the French what they should do, telling the militias what they should do, and telling the Continental Army what they should do, right? So they try and give it to Lafayette, to which Lafayette, with just the kind of panache that he has and wit and humor that he has, turns to the second in command who is presenting the weapon and says, "I don't want it. Give it to him," and points to George Washington. Right? So then the second in command, I kind of feel bad for this guy because he gets kind of mistreated because of Cornwallis here. So he turns and goes to hand it to George Washington, to which George Washington says, "I don't want it. Give it to him," and points to his second in command, right? Like kind of like they're being pretty salty with each other at this moment, because of Cornwallis's unwillingness to come out and meet with him face to face. So then this guy, probably obviously flustered by this whole situation, Cornwallis' second in command, then turns to Washington's second in command to present the weapon, present the saber. To which Washington's second in command says, "Well, I don't want it. Just throw it over there with the rest of the weapons." Right, with this big stack of weapons that is being created from the French soldiers being disarmed. And it's just such a funny moment. And just despite all the pomp and circumstance that is supposed to be present in these moments, you can really kind of see the tension that is there between the colonial forces and the colonial forces with the French and the British, right? And again, the British and the French at this time kind of taking every moment they can to fight each other, right? We talked about this a decade before this was the French and Indian War, and then we got the Revolutionary War, and then after this they're going to be involved in the French Revolution and Napoleon's attempt to expand French borders, right? So they do kind of are, they're at each other's throats all the time. And we see that kind of coming through in this moment, which has always kind of just made me laugh. It's just such a funny moment with these different leaders. Like a lot of times you just get the facts, like, this battle and this battle, but you really kind of see some of that character coming through in Cornwallis, in Lafayette, and in George Washington in this moment. It always kind of makes me laugh. All right. With that, guys, we are finished with the Revolutionary War. Okay, we're not really going to talk about much else with this. We are going to move on to the American Constitution and political systems, which we will start after the break. So on Friday, we may talk a little bit more about this. If you guys have any questions, anything you want to discuss, we can go over it for sure. But otherwise, we will get into that, those political systems and the Constitution after the break. So that's all I have for you today, guys. I hope you have a good snow day, and we will see you on Friday.